Welcome, everyone. I'm Teresa Mangum. I'm a faculty member in Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies in English, and I'm also the director of the Urbana Center for Advanced Studies. And we are so delighted to have you here and to have our panel here today. A little bit of business before we get started. Want to thank the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the University of Iowa President's Office, and Office of the Vice President for Research and Economic Development, the Public Policy Center, and the Pomerantz Center for helping to make today possible. What we have planned today is that I will introduce the panel, and then President Coleman will say a bit about the Lincoln Project to orient us all on what kind of work's been done. And I've been asked to say that there were copies of the report from the Lincoln Project we were handing out, but we've run out. However, it's online, and so you can find it online. Just Google Lincoln Project and AAU, and there it will be. And so you'll hear about it today. And then we've put together a few questions based on the panel's visit to other universities and kinds of topics that came up. But we also want to make sure that you all have a chance if you have specific questions. So there are cards. Steve, back there. Pradarelli, and he has note cards where you can jot down a question, just so we can keep the flow going. We'll ask you to jot down cards, he'll take them up, and I'll weave your questions into the questions that the panel had suggested they might be beneficial to talk about. But we're happy to be flexible as we go. So that's the overall plan. There's also a reception afterward next door in Bell and Blank, and you're all most welcome to join us there. Let me do introductions, and I won't do justice to anyone because I know you really want to hear from them, so I'm going to be quick. Bruce Harreld is the 21st president of the University of Iowa since 2015. He received a Bachelor of Engineering degree from Purdue and a Master's of Business Administration from Harvard University. And in addition to his career in the corporate world, he has taught at the Harvard Business College and at Northwestern University in the Kellogg School of Management. Mary Sue Coleman, we are so thrilled to welcome back to the University of Iowa. Former President Coleman began her academic life right down the road as an undergraduate in chemistry at Grinnell College, and then received her doctorate in biochemistry at Chapel Hill. She's now president of the Association of American Universities, which we all call the AAU, after serving as president of the University of Iowa, to our delight, and then as president of the University of Michigan. She was one of the co-chairs that led the Lincoln Project, so that she has the big picture of the research that the group has done, which was an initiative of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Time magazine named her one of the nation's 10 best college presidents, and the American Council on Education honored her with a Lifetime Achievement Award just a couple of years ago. Phyllis Wise is the former chancellor of the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana and former provost at the University of Washington. The importance of her biomedical research on women's health and how hormones influence learning and memory led to her membership in the National Academy of Medicine and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She received her undergrad degree from Swarthmore College and her PhD from University of Michigan, all kinds of connections. And finally, former U.S. Congressman James Leach is University of Iowa Chair in Public Affairs, a visiting professor of law, senior scholar, and interim director of the UI Museum of Art. Congressman Leach, who has a bachelor's degree from Princeton and a master's of arts from Johns Hopkins, joined the UI College of Faculty after most recently serving as the chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities. During his distinguished 30-year career in Congress, he was showered with accolades, perhaps none more impressive than the Wayne Morse Integrity in Politics Award. So thank you all for being here, first of all. And we'll start by turning things over to Mary Sue.
Okay, I think I'm going to come over and stand there because I can't see about a quarter of the audience, and so let me stand here.
And I'm just looking for where you're.
I've got
You
it.
got it.
Yeah, I've got it. I've got it. Now, is this okay? Can you hear now? Good. Great. Well, first of all, I have to tell you what an absolute joy it is for me to be back. And then I got here early this morning, and after my friend Mary Sue took me to lunch, I was able to go on a wonderful tour from Rod Leonard's of the new buildings since the flood. And I have to tell you that I am blown away. The architecture is to die for. And the buildings are beautiful, 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 and it makes me, I didn't want you to have to go through the flood to get this, but you got something really great as a consequence, and my gratitude to everybody and to you, President Harreld, for the work, and I know so many people have worked on that, but I just can't tell you how excited I am to see the treasure that you have now. And so one of the things that I want to do today is to talk about why public research universities matter and why this place matters for the state of Iowa. So the Lincoln Project is really named in honor of Abraham Lincoln and his signing of the bill, the Morrill Act, that created the land-grant universities. He did it in 1862, and that was a time of great turmoil in the United States, and yet he signed this act. And it made a world of difference in our country. So what we started in our project was to look at institutions, universities that are rated either high research or very high research by the Carnegie Corporation. There are 145 public research universities across the United States that meet that category, at least one in every state. And our mission was to understand what is going on and to try to suggest some ways in which we can maintain the excellence and accessibility of these institutions in the face of massive state disinvestment. So our advisory group was largely people from a cross-section of disciplines and interest, and two of my colleagues who were on the team with me are Phyllis Wise and Jim Leach. We had 5 publications. The one that you received is the last one, the recommendations and the summary. The 5 are why they matter, the role of research universities in society, the changes in state funding, the massive disinvestment by state governments, understanding the financial model, that is the basic finances that most in the public do not understand, serving the public good, ways we contribute to the health of the U.S. society, and then finally, the recommendations that you see, an educational compact for the 21st century. Given that public universities are responsible for educating the great majority of college students, it's really chilling to examine the budgets as measured by expenditures per full-time student compared to those of corresponding private universities. Private universities in the AAU, the Association of American Universities, spend 3 to 4 times per student more than do the publics. Now, I can certainly applaud my colleagues for being efficient, but the numbers do reflect what a difficult financial situation most public universities face. So with this very shortened presentation, all I want to do is to set the stage for you and to show you what we found in our work. Okay, this first slide really shows you state general fund expenditures in 2014, estimated by category. You'll see that higher ed is the third category there. I don't know whether I have a pointer or not, but elementary and secondary education is by far the greatest expenditure from the state, then Medicaid, then higher education, then corrections, though you'll see later corrections is catching up very fast. In virtually every state across the country, and this is just an aggregate for the states, support for higher education, for public higher education per full-time student in constant 2014 dollars has dropped dramatically. And we found in looking at this that the research university category, kind of counterintuitively, the drop is most severe. It's more severe than community colleges, more severe than comprehensive institutions that do not offer graduate degrees. The main driver in the general fund competition is Medicaid. It's changed from 9.5% of general fund budgets of states in 1990 to 19.1% in 2014. So I think one of the things we all need to recognize is that legislators face difficult choices. They have a certain amount of money, and they have to invest that money in the needs of the state. And so I really don't think that the disinvestment has come about because somehow legislators hate universities and they don't want to fund them. They have real pressures, and they have to make really tough decisions in allocating resources. So another surprising finding to us, though, was the growth in correction spending, where higher education increases have been pretty static from 1986 to 2013. Corrections percent has increased by 141%, and in some states now, more is invested in corrections than in higher education. Bob Bergeneau, who was my co-chair on this project, the recently retired Chancellor at Berkeley, we were astounded to discover that in California now spends more on corrections than they do on their higher education. Now, of course, the state disinvestment directly affects tuition. And one of the things that happens in research universities, and in universities in general, is that we're one of the only state agencies or state departments that has revenue-generating options. And that option, a big part of it is tuition. And they know that. They understand that. And so as a consequence, funding higher education really is the balance wheel for most state budgets. And this just shows you what's happened over 3 time periods from 2001 to 2012, where there's been an almost inverse relationship between the state appropriations and tuition, depending on the year, so you can really see what has happened and why that has been so problematic for us. We often hear that the reason that tuition is increasing is because we are irresponsible and because we have administrative bloat and because all sorts of things we're spending money on don't need to be spent. Well, it turns out that a careful analysis by economists outside of our group, we didn't do the analysis, that driving 80% of the tuition increase in the public research universities is decrease in state support. So 80% can be contributed to this dramatic drop in state support. A 9% increase is an investment in instruction, new instruction technologies, and 6% is an administrative cost largely related to the increased regulatory burden that we find ourselves in. So we can firmly say that administrative bloat is a myth, and the costs have been kept under control. We actually did an analysis that there's been no change in the workforce and administration throughout the last 30 years of public research universities, and we're educating more students than we ever have before. Most public research universities have dramatically increased their philanthropic efforts, and Iowa is very fortunate to have a long history with the University of Iowa Foundation raising private support. Even given this, we have a long way to go, and I think it's sobering to look at the difference between endowment spending in private universities per FTE versus public universities. So what this graph shows you is those top 2 lines that are going up is the endowment payout for per FTE. It's at private universities. I've broken out the AAU privates and all high research activity institutions. And then the second line there are the non-AAU high research activity, and all these lines on the bottom are the publics. So even though the University of Iowa Foundation has a nice endowment, and it does have a nice endowment, its endowment spending per student, because of the scale of the institution, is very, very tiny, and it cannot currently replace what the state does. We are encouraging all public research universities to increase their philanthropic efforts. And in fact, what we found is when we did a survey of our 145 cohort, 90% of them were either in a campaign or completing a fundraising campaign. So they've got the picture, they know what to do. Now I have one additional slide to show you before we start really talking and having some answers to questions. These data were developed after we completed the Lincoln Project. It was done by a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford, Charlie Eaton, Henry Brady, who's the Dean of Public Policy at Berkeley, Mike Houts, who's at NYU, and Bob Bergeneau. And what they're showing in this graph is the gray lines are Pell Grants per student. That is Pell Grants per FTE student across all the states. And the interesting thing is that Pell Grants really function as a voucher. So the student gets the Pell Grant, they can use it, and it's pretty constant across the states. The orange line shows you need-based aid that the states add to the Pell Grant students. And there is a vast, vast difference. And you will note that Iowa is way down on the right. It provides almost no need-based state aid per student. These ones at the top are California, Wyoming, New Jersey, Washington, North Carolina, Texas. I have to say that Michigan is not much better than Iowa, which was always a great upsetness to me when I was at Michigan. But this is the kind of thing that a state can make a difference. If policymakers want to make a difference, they can make a huge difference, because we know that if students come from low-income families, that they're very scared on taking debt, and if they do take on debt, they're much more likely to default with very low debt amounts than our students that are from higher income families that are taking on more debt. So it's a very interesting problem, and I think these kind of data will be very helpful, as we try to think about policy issues that we can help with. So we do have a series of recommendations, and I think we're going to talk about some of those in the questions and answers. And so I'll stop right there and look forward to the continuing dialogue. So, Teresa?
It's hard to know whether to clap on some of this news, I think. So we'll start out with a question for Mary Sue. And given what you've just given to us, this sobering information, how are you making a case not just for higher education but for research universities in the 21st century?
Sure. So I'm speaking to the choir here, because probably all of you in this room know and understand the history of the development of the great research universities in the United States. The great inflection point came post-World War II, when Vannevar Bush was a science advisor and created the National Science Foundation. And the idea of the country was that we were going to give the responsibility, much of the responsibility for fundamental discovery-initiated research in this country to be done in our great universities. And that was the start of the federal funding that really did change the dynamic and created this whole wave of research discoveries. And in fact, I was just in a meeting with the Business Roundtable in Washington with Wes Bush, who is the CEO of Lockheed Martin, and we were talking about university corporate partnerships and how important this relationship was. And he said, corporate America could not survive without the fundamental research of research universities, because they have had to let a lot of their research activities go. They do the development part, but they don't do the fundamental research because their shareholders don't have the long time span. We have an infinite time span in universities. We can be patient. I think one of the most incredible things that happened a year ago was the announcement of the LIGO experiment of gravitational waves. The National Science Foundation funded LIGO for 45 years. They never gave up on it. And we had one of the greatest discoveries confirming one of Einstein's theories of gravitational waves that we have ever seen in this country. It was because we did it and because it happened at universities. We have all these products, all these new industries that develop because of what we do, the smartphone, your touch sensor on the phone, all all these activities, all the things in medical research. So I don't have any trouble talking about the benefits of research, and corporate America will back me up, because we have had many corporate leaders sign on to the innovation deficit, talking to Congress, speaking directly to Congress about this relationship and the importance of these universities and why it's the very survival. It's an existential threat for the nation, a global threat if we're not willing to continue to support these universities.
So if I can just add to that, Mary Sue, I think one of the beautiful parts about research-intensive universities is that our students participate in the research. And so the students are learning as they discover along with their faculty mentors. Yeah. And, textbooks, by the time they're published, and sometimes they're not even used anymore, but are at least 5 years old. The information is at least 5 years old. And some of it is already outdated by the time the book is published. When students get to work with a faculty member in research and scholarship, whether or not you're talking about English, fine arts, physics, or engineering, they are at the cutting edge of discovery.
And I'll just remind you that if you have questions yourself, please do fill out a card and just flag, and someone will pick it up for you so that we can include your questions too. Jim, if you wouldn't mind, the big picture, what do we know about educational priorities for the new administration?
Well, we're in unprecedented times, and everybody in this room is an equal expert. We're looking at an administration that is more different from all other administrations maybe in our history. Some of this has some pluses, some of it has some minuses. Intriguingly, your Congress on some issues is likely to be more conservative than the administration. On other issues, it might not be the case. And we're going to see some very interesting constitutional issues that relate to where is power. Is it in a legislative body? Is it in the executive body? Is it in a judicial body? And this is going to be an experience for all of us, and we've probably never seen anything quite like it. In terms of education, there are 4 or 5 major institutions. Mary Sue referenced the National Science Foundation. That's clearly central to public education. At this university, probably a little bit more important is the National Institute of Health. And it is of seminal significance. And then you also have institutions like the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities. My personal sense is that the NSF and NIH are in solid shape to survive. What their funding levels will be, nobody knows. And only time will tell. There have been some conservatives that want to increase substantially NIH. Others want to see it plummet, and we'll see who prevails in this battle. The NEA and the NEH are right on the cusp of being maybe 50-50, maybe even less than that, of surviving at all. And these are relatively small federal agencies. They're also very symbolic federal agencies. The arts really symbolize a standing up for and celebration of creativity. The National Endowment for the Humanities stands up for and symbolizes federal funds coming into looking at the broad spectrum of humanities subjects, history, philosophy, literature. And in doing this, one of the things that should be mentioned that the NSF, NIH, NEA, and NEH all have in common is something new to the realm of governance. And that is this word, peer review. And what peer review means is that experts come in from around the country to assess things in areas in which they have expertise. And it depoliticizes all 4 of these institutions in a very major way. And these institutions basically are incubators more than leaders. That is, they are the type of institution, and it's novel in history, that are designed to be listening to the best and the brightest in given fields and following their lead. So the institutions follow rather than lead. They incubate. And the track record is sensational. And let me just speak for the institution I know the best, the National Endowment for the Humanities. It has spurred over 1 billion words of scholarship. Programs, scholars it has assisted have won over 20 Pulitzers, Bancroft Prizes through galore. And then it's reached out to the public in really sensational ways. Over 1 billion people have watched NEH documentaries. I mean, you think of Rick Burns and the Civil War. When I was at the institution, we did 4 documentaries on the civil rights movement, beginning with the abolitionists and ending with the story of Loving. And by Loving, I mean the Loving ruling, which was a 1967 Supreme Court ruling about interracial marriage. And by the way, and I'm going to kind of conclude with this state has been an innovator at the front edge of almost every major legal issue in the history of this country, this short history. We were ahead of the Loving decision by over a century in the state of Iowa. On civil rights, before we were a state, we affirmed that slavery would not be allowed. This state is really at the forefront, and when you think of science, and I'm going to tell you an anecdote, one of the proudest kind of comments I've ever made was in an introduction of an MIT president who was becoming a cabinet member, and he was being eulogized for being an internationalist. And I said, we're proud of MIT. And someday they might catch up with the University of Iowa, which has the world's only intergalacticus. After all, we've sent an object into another solar system, and we're reading its information to this day. And when the rest of the world catches up to this public university, this country will be okay. Thank you.
The answer to this question has already gotten started, I would say, in the discussion, but bringing things to Iowa specifically, Bruce, I wonder if you would talk about what benefits you see for higher education offers to students, to the state here in Iowa, how we make that case.
I'd love to, but I couldn't, just before I do that, I couldn't help but look at Don Garnett's face out there as our space physicist in the room as you were telling that last story. That was just wonderful. And I would say on these last 2 questions, one thing I think maybe we want to talk about here if we get time is it seems to me we've moved from a world maybe a generation ago that was investing in our future. And now it seems like a lot of it is, what do you do for me now? And it's short-termism, and maybe we can come back to that. But to your question, Teresa, first of all, what do institutions like this, public research institutions, do for students? Well, I mean, at one level, and I continue to be reminded of when a political candidate came through the state and talking about plumbers versus philosophers, David, and said all we need is more plumbers. I just don't know many of us, or at least my own kids, or the students I interact with, that at 18 years old know what they want to do for the rest of their life. Now, there are a few, but most of us don't. And so the question is, how do we acquire the skills to continue to learn, relearn, and help others learn? And I think that's what these institutions at the core are really all about. And you can see it in the numbers. I mean, if you want to get at the core a business and economist, and if you want to jump down into the numbers, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics in 2015 said if you earn a bachelor's degree, you are likely to earn, on average, 70% more than somebody with a high school background. A professional degree is 155% more. The unemployment rates are staggeringly lower the higher you go in your education. So I think there is an economic point to this, but I think there's perhaps also a real benefit that you prepare yourself for life. and you build leadership skills. I mean, if everything was just as simple as just simple book learning, then we probably could take a lot of things to the internet. But you know what? There's a reason why we send our adolescents in the last few years of their adolescence to institutions like this, to round them out and to let them experience new things and get leadership skills that early on. And so there's a residentialness that I think is really, really important. And it makes then, I think the second piece is what does it mean for the country? Let's jump to that. I think they're better citizens. I think they can reason, debate, engage with points of view that they may not agree with, but they can do that in a civil way, push others' thinking, push their own thinking. I think that's what makes a democracy. I think that's a cornerstone. I think there's a reason in 1847 that this state put so much money behind education. What really worries me is that if that discontinues, what next? And then in between, the issue for the state, I've been going around the state saying, it feels like to me that we now view higher education, public higher education, as an expense to be minimized in this state. It's something to be squeezed because we don't have the resources. And I guess I just go back to this short-termism and say, when are we going to start investing in our future again? Because it seems to me these are amazingly huge opportunities for economic development. We create a lot of intellectual property. Why don't we develop businesses around that intellectual property? Why don't we employ people? I grew up in the middle of Appalachia, and of all places, my wife shows me an article the other day that the state of West Virginia just did a big economic development study, and they were looking for what's driving their economy the most over the last decade. And lo and behold, West Virginia concluded it was their public research institutions that developed a whole portion, the number of corridors in the state of West Virginia. And so I'm just kind of going around the state saying, hey, wait a minute, turn us loose, let us compete, let us invest, let us create jobs. And by the way, in the process, we'll train our students better as we get them earlier involved in all that. So I think it's our future in many ways. Sorry for the long answer.
No, thank you.
Sure.
I'm going to weave together one of the questions from the audience with this next question, and it is for Mary Sue. What is the importance of need-based aid, to follow on your slide? And one of the questions that one of the audience members asked is specifically thinking about rural students.
Well, sure. There's been Carolyn Hoxby done a lot of research. There's been tremendous amount of research in terms of the missed opportunities in this country to recruit students to excellent universities. We have a lot of data that shows that if students go to universities that will challenge them, that is, if they go to a step up to a university, they actually have more success than if they go step down to a lower tier university. So one of the challenges we have in this country is that we know how to get to urban populations and density populations where there are high schools, where many students haven't had opportunity, and we should be working for those high schools. But it's much more difficult to go to the rural high schools where there may be only 5 students in the whole high school who might, let's say, be able to get into, I'm going to use the University of Michigan as my counter here because it's the institution I know the best. And in order to reach out to them and let them know about the opportunity, we already know from Hoxby's work and the work of others that most of these students have no conception of the difference in quality of universities. They have nobody around them who's been to one of these universities. Their parents generally haven't gone to university, so they're first generation. And they are so spread out that we can't possibly recruit them to the same intensity that we recruit in urban areas, because you can't go to a school and get 20 students that you're talking to about admission to the University of Michigan. So you've got this huge problem, and there are thousands of these students. So the University of Michigan a couple of years ago started a program, and this is where technology, I think, comes in. We think about advanced technology as doing online education, and I don't think that's where the promise is. There are niche things for online education, that's fine. The promise of the technology and the analytics that we have is that we actually, at quite low cost, can reach out and personalize the invitation to the one student in Alpena, Michigan, who has a really good SAT score and has done really well, but doesn't know a thing about the University of Michigan, or the guidance counselor has told that student, don't even bother to apply to Michigan, you won't get in. We can now isolate that student, personalize the invitation, and say, Johnny, you know, we've seen something about you, and if you'll come, and many of these kids are need-based, many of them are, because they come from poor communities, that if you'll apply to the University of Michigan, you know, we'd really like for you to consider us. The take-up rate after the first year was astounding. It was like 60%. 60 or 70% of the students that got that personalized outreach decided to apply, and most of them were admitted to the university, and then got access to Pell Grants and other forms of aid that the university could provide. So getting to those rural students is tough, and it's in particular a big state like Michigan, it's really tough. But it's something that we have to work at, because it's an untapped resource in the country for really bright people. And I know a lot of universities are working on it. You're probably working on it here at Iowa too.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The other side of the equation, I think, is equally important, which is it's one thing to get them the financial aid and to get them to an institution like ours or Michigan.
And get it to them quickly, and get them to offer quickly
The
on financial aid.
Absolutely. And they need to be hugged and
They
feel
hug
like they're
quickly.
unique
Right.
and wanted. But then they get here. And I think the other side of the issue that we're spending quite a bit of time talking about and focusing on, what are the support mechanisms when they get here? Because many of them don't have, the parents often
Right.
haven't been in an environment like this. So they
Right.
go home for their first Thanksgiving, and
Yeah.
they're overwhelmed. The parents don't know that maybe they do need to study. And so
Yeah.
there are a series of support mechanisms I think we need to do a better job of. My guess is Illinois found the same thing,
Yeah.
to keep them here
Yeah.
and to calm them down and let them know that we want them to succeed, and we'll do everything possible to make that happen.
So I think one of the things that's really interesting that was revealed in the Lincoln Project study was that the public research universities are doing the education of the masses. We are doing it at scale.
Yeah.
Roughly 75% of college-age students go to a public university. So if we were to not support them and they were to close down or not be able to take as many students, Harvard, Yale, Duke, Stanford could not absorb them. They just don't have the capacity. So we are doing it at scale. And I think the other thing that you point out is, and was revealed also in the Lincoln Project, is there are more students who go to public universities who come from families where there is financial need. So the wealthier families can afford to send their kids to Harvard and those schools. We are getting large numbers of students who also are first generation to ever go to school, to a university, and whose parents are still not financially well off. What does that mean? It's exactly what President Harreld said. They not only need to learn how to learn, but they also need the counseling, the mentoring, the advising, because they can't go home and get it.
And actually, Phyllis, if you wouldn't mind continuing, another question, and your career brings this front and center, is how do we communicate the importance of scientific research as an enterprise? How do we explain more broadly how we're doing science and why that should be a critical part of the university?
Well, it's an answer that sometimes is a little bit, it's hard to put it into an elevator speech. That is to say that the thing about scientific research is so much of the great discoveries are serendipitous. I'll give you one example in the area of molecular biology, and that is that Dan Nathans, who won the Nobel Prize for figuring out restriction enzymes, which is the kind of enzymes that cut DNA at a very specific site, was doing it just not because he thought that he was discovering that particular thing, but it led to our ability to sequence the human genome, because you could cut the DNA into little segments and then sequence little parts and then put it back together and figure out the whole genome. This kind of research is not hypothesis-driven, it is curiosity-driven. And it's the kind of research that can only go on at universities, because as Mary Sue Coleman pointed out at the very beginning, it's not the kind of thing that drug companies are willing to risk because they need to have a drug on the shelf within 5 years. It is being done at the University of Iowa, at the University of Illinois, at the University of Michigan, and the major public research universities, again, at scale. So, it is really true that if
So interestingly enough, I want to pick up on that because I'm also I have many hats now. I'm on a National Academy's study about PhD education. And one of the things we've been talking about is what is a PhD? What should it be? What does it look like? What are the unique aspects of getting a PhD? And we've been debating all this. And it has come, we've thought about, okay, what if we want to change this dynamic about the difficulty of scientists speaking to lay audiences, or not even scientists, humanities PhDs, speaking about what they do and why it's important. And so we've been sort of rolling around with this idea, well, maybe as part of getting a PhD, part of your dissertation has to be, you have to write a chapter in your dissertation in absolutely lay terms that somebody who doesn't know diddle squat about science can understand why you're doing this and why it matters, and you don't get a PhD until you learn how to do that. Now, if we had the hundreds of thousands of students in our universities who are getting PhDs and to get their PhD, they had to do that, we could change the world pretty fast. And so we're really thinking about this as a recommendation because, we haven't felt like we've had to do it in the past. We should have always been doing it because we want people to share the joy. There is no greater joy. You all know this, who do fundamental research, when you're the one that discovers something that nobody else knows. And for 24 hours, you're the only one in the world that knows it. And you should be able to share that joy because it's like a heroin high. So so we could maybe do that, and it would really make things better. I don't know.
Mary Sue, so John Keller, raise your hand. Raise it higher so Mary can see. There he is. There's his hand. Connect, because John has been doing some work in our graduate college on dramatically improving our PhD, the poster speaches, and how we can get those, exactly.
See, you're already leading the pack.
No, well, I think we could use all the help we can get, but there's a connection here we ought to make. Yeah, that's right, because I think you're absolutely right. Yeah. Why do we want to do something we can't explain to anybody else?
Exactly.
It doesn't seem like education to me.
You're right.
If I could make one comment here. Larry Summers, a former president of Harvard, once commented that women weren't very good at science. And here, Bruce and I are at a little disadvantage because we're surrounded by these two brilliant scientists. But I think because we're talking about public universities, it has to be said that the science that's come out of here also has saved America. And I want to stress this. It was the digital computer discovered at Iowa State based on University of Illinois work to begin with a number of Nobels that allowed us to break some codes in World War II. It was Jim Van Allen in World War II who developed a fuse for our long guns on ships, and then a fuse that became a proximity fuse. That is one of the four great inventions in military development in wartime ever. And this came out of a public university. And people that advanced because of their knowledge of science. And then there are people that applied science. And I'm going to just stop with this other one. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Mac Showers from Iowa City, Iowa, who was a graduate of this university. In World War II, in Honolulu, he was part of a group that was breaking the Japanese code. And they had this message that it looked as if the Japanese were, in 1942, preparing to attack somewhere. And they didn't know where. but they got from the code it was AF. And they didn't know where AF was, but they thought it might be midway. And so it was Max Showers, who was not a scientist, but using scientific technique, and because he had an imagination and curiosity, that came up with the idea that they sent a false message from Midway to themselves that would be broken by the Japanese. And within 24 hours, they broke a Japanese message saying, and the message was that they'd run out of water on Midway because of a given type of accident. They picked up a message that the Japanese said, our intelligence has picked up that on AF, there's no water. And what I'm saying is that you develop these skills because you've gone through history class and philosophy class and logical class. And this public university helps save the world. Period.
Agreed. We're done.
Actually, that's a good lead into a question from an audience member about the multiple roles of the public research university. And one of the audience members asks about how we balance the research, the kind of research we've just been talking about with the teaching mission, but also with the public engagement mission. In some ways, you were heading that direction, Mary Sue, even talking about accessibility and sharing ideas. But do you all have thoughts about how the public engagement mission of a public university integrates with these other responsibilities?
Well, maybe I can start, because the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign is in a small town much like this, and much like the University of Michigan is. And I think public engagement in universities like ours is particularly important, because the towns in which our universities are situated are only as healthy and vibrant as the university is. And the university is only as vibrant as the communities around us. And so the give and take, the public engagement of the university with the community around it is absolutely essential. And I think that that leads to economic development, not only in terms of money, but social development as well, and cultural development. We are the universities are oftentimes the centers of the cultural richness around the town. And I know about your new performing arts center, and I know about the developing museum that is, I mean, this is what the university contributes in terms of public engagement.
Yeah, let me pick up on that, I'm still stumbling through this issue in my own mind. But the one thing that strikes me is everything you said is absolutely true, and we have a wonderful environment for the arts, sports, academics. But it troubles me that we sit here and hope everyone comes. And what I'm struggling with is, what is our role in reaching out and going out to the rest of the state? And some of our colleges, I was at an event a few months ago with our College of Public Health in the northeastern part of the state, and they just went there for a day to talk about the public health issues in that community. And then also, as they listened to the public health issues in that community, offered some thoughts on what we had learned in our college about how to deal with some of those. And it was a wonderful interaction of researchers and practitioners and the public. And I guess my point is, I think we sometimes in our universities get real smug and wait for everyone to come. That isn't what you say, but we kind of fall into that, and we get really busy and consumed. And we forget that we have a real we owe the public something back. And we need to, if we don't participate in that, we actually, in a sense, kind of fall into them forgetting about us and what we can do, and kind of bring it on ourselves.
So I think you're exactly right about that, and I know that Iowa has had a great tradition of going out in the state, and which I admired enormously when I was here. But I want to point out another little anecdote to you, and it's in your book if you look here on page 23, because there's a At least I think it's on 23, yeah. Okay, there's this little map of the United States on 23. And what this is about, this is an interesting exercise because of the technology that we have now and our ability to link databases in a way that we never have before. And I'm proud to say that Iowa was one of the initial investors in this consortium. It's the IRIS project, the Institute for Research and Innovation in Science that is actually being run out of the University of Michigan just to house all the data. But my anecdote is this. I was in Nashville, Tennessee about 1.5 years ago, and I was speaking to a group of legislators about the Lincoln Project. And I was going, their eyes were glazing over, and I was going through all this about how wonderful, the University of Tennessee is and how important it is to the state. And then I showed them this map. And what this map shows you, this is a very early data set from the IRIS project, because we can now link all the federal research funding that goes into universities. We can link it with census data and IRS data and find out precisely where every dollar is being spent on every federal research grant. And so what this shows you for the federal research is about $1.8 billion at 8 universities in the Midwest, and the University of Iowa is one of them. The dollars expended on those research grants get spent because of the goods and services that the research needs in something like over 1,700 counties in the United States. And they looked at that graph and they said, you mean there's money spent in Tennessee from work that's going on at Iowa and Michigan and Indiana? I said, yes, there's a lot of money that gets spent there. And they were excited beyond belief. And I said, okay, well, what do you think would happen if we put all 145 research universities and their research expenditures on that graph? It would show how intimately this research is related to this U.S. economy. I mean, that isn't even about the cultural and the things the quality of life that we bring. We're creating jobs, and we're creating a lot of jobs because we buy stuff to do the research. And this is the first time in our history that we've been able to document it. And why we're so excited is that we can now document it. And the other thing we can document that we're beginning to do, and the papers are beginning to come out that I'm incredibly excited about, is that we can track where our undergraduate students that work on research end up in careers. We can track where our graduate students end up, where our postdocs, what kind of jobs they go to, what kind of industries they go to. And it's astounding how we support the U.S. economy. And so, that's the kind of information that we've got to have to show people that, to talk about just shutting this down, I mean, it is an existential threat for the country.
Oh,
you just can't even talk that way, that somehow these universities are not important and they don't underpin everything that we are as a nation. And so it's exciting that we have the information now that we can actually do it.
Well, and I've been leaning on Mike Porter, who's written a lot about competitive strategy in all sorts of domains. In 2007, he did a little piece on public research institutions, and the point of the whole piece was the smarter public research institutions and the smarter communities interlinked to develop a common development plan of how they can scratch each other's back, so to speak. But along the way, he mentioned, look, they are developers of our future workforce. Well, I think we all know that. But the next piece is they're major employers. And for every dollar spent, the low end is 3 times and the high end is 5 times of a multiplier effect as people then spend their earnings in the community and those get recycled. And so, I sort of jokingly say the $9 million cut that we recently had is a $27 to a $45 million hole in our corridor here. But then they also are developers of real estate. They're purchasers of goods. Then they are creators of basic intellectual property. And then finally, and I think the big payoff, if we could get to it, is they can actually build businesses and jobs around that intellectual property. And it's a whole collection of things. So to your point, if you lift that out across all of the R1 institutions in the United States, you've got a huge economic and cultural whole. And that's kind of where we're headed. And the question, I think, to some extent, is what's going to replace that? Or if the public institutions are going to survive, and I think they can, what do they need to do to survive? Because they can't depend on the state, and they may not be able to depend on the federal government anymore. So then
They need to have the strings cut a little bit, and they need to be allowed to be more entrepreneurial.
yeah. And you mean by strings the regulatory controls, state.
The reaching
yeah,
in, the
yeah.
reaching in, and you know, one of the things that is a positive, we hope it may be, we don't know that yet, at least there's talk about it, is that we may be facing a more lenient regulatory environment. And that may be something that we can get some relief from. Effort reporting, if we can get rid of that.
From your lips to God's ears.
All the scientists know about effort reporting, but but it takes a lot of time, and we spend a lot of money on things like that. So,
Leaping from the national to the international, several people in the audience have asked about how current immigration policies are affecting universities.
pretty much a disaster. AAU has been very vocal about this, as has APLU and numbers of groups. In fact, I had one of my presidents from one of the AAU institutions sort of wearily said to me last week, I've been asked to sign on to 11 sign-ons, protesting the immigration ban and the travel ban. So here's the problem, and you all know it. It isn't even the 6 countries that are currently in the ban, though we believe that there may be some constitutional issues there and there'll be legal challenges to that. The problem is a chilling effect to everybody from every country. And while some institutions may not see a big drop in their international applications, what I'm hearing about sporadically now is already in some programs, AAU institutions are seeing at least a 50% drop in applications, and particularly in fields where they can't afford to have the drop, in some of the engineering fields and the science fields where there's just not enough interest from domestic students. I mean, we would wish there would be more, of course, more domestic students that go into some of these programs, but we're worried about the spillover effects. We're worried about how we're going to be viewed as a nation, and whether people are even going to want to come here as tourists. I mean, I think that there are big issues out there that we're only beginning to see a little bit of the tip of the iceberg about what's going to happen, unless the rhetoric changes and the dynamic changes. But you may have some thoughts about that too.
I will only add that from an economic point of view, education is also an economic competitive industry. And we are losing now to many other countries who are jumping in. But that is easily the least important aspect of this. The United States of America is undergoing a total revision in how we are perceived in the world in as rapid a time frame as has ever occurred in human history. And we're going to have to be awfully careful that the idea and the ideal of America are no longer looked at in the same way as they were a generation, 2 generations ago. And this is a very dangerous world we're in, and it's going to have implications for education in other ways, and that is how we spend money at the federal level, because this is going to be a very expensive way for the United States to operate.
I'll just say it's just it's just having a chilling effect, and we've got fear, I think is the right word, in that community on our campus. We have 86 students from the original 7 countries, and when we've got most of them together over 2 days and just started listening to what we could do to help and make sure they knew they were wanted here, we need them here, and we'll do all we can to support them. Now, having said that, I'm watching the narrative on the news shows, and people see, I'm not sure what the problem is we're trying to solve. But I remember one physician on a Friday afternoon came in and said, you know, it's really kind of crazy, but this morning I was helping Iowans. And I'm from one of these countries. And now I'm actually, I can't leave the country because I can't come back. And then another gentleman said that, you know, I'm the unluckiest person in the world because, you know, 5 years ago I was ready to go back to Mosul, and 2 days before I was going to leave, it was attacked by ISIL. And then now I can't go home again because I can't come back, and I have my dream job. What do I do? And these are people, I would say, I think something like, Barry, you remember, is it, I think 8 are undergraduate, and all the rest of the 86 are graduate students, postdocs, medical doctors doing their training. And these are people serving our society and our community. And so there's this perception that they're something else that's not good, and that just isn't true. So I get confused. I'm just trying to figure out what's the problem that we're really trying to solve here.
I want to be sure in the last 20 or so minutes that we have that we do hear about some of the solutions you all are recommending in the report, and also some of the good ideas that you're hearing around the country as you talk to other universities. Mary Sue, would you want to start off?
Sure, I can start, and then my colleagues can add in. So what we tried to do in this whole project is to sort of think about blue sky efforts. We're faced with this issue. We understand that states have to make difficult choices, and that they are, and I'm convinced that most legislators don't hate their public universities in their state. It's not that they're willingly not funding them, but they're faced with difficult circumstances. So we've thought about ways in which universities themselves can be given more latitude to do the things that they need to do. One of the things that I've advocated for a long time, and I know it's very difficult given the election cycles that we have in states, but I think states that are willing to take a long-term view, at least a 10-year view, with aspirations for a percentage that they should be funding for their public universities. That discussion should not be off the table. Nobody seems to want to engage in it, but what is the right percentage? Should they fund 20%? Should they fund 30%? Should it be 10%? Whatever it is, they should set a goal and try to achieve that goal every year, rather than leaving the universities as the last thing that they look at, because they know universities can raise revenue and they'll just be the balance wheel. So we really think that's important. Michigan actually has kind of started down that path and has continued so far, but the effort was led by a business group. It was not led by the legislature. There was a vacuum, and the business group stepped in and said, you know, business leaders from Michigan, we're going to have a 10-year plan. Legislature, here it is. They went and lobbied for it, and they're trying to work on that plan. So I think the corporate sector can be very much more vocal and helpful than they have been, and they need to have that kind of partnerships that they're willing to go to the legislature and say this is important, because they have the advantage of receiving the products of our universities, and they need to have skin in the game. And there's some other things that they could do too that are a little bit more out there and wild, but they could do that, and it's not going to cost them anything. Universities have to be responsible. We have to set targets every year for becoming more efficient, saving more money, and publish those targets and let people know what we're doing. I know you're doing that here. We certainly did it at the University of Michigan. Everything we do, whether it's a rationalization of IT, whether it's looking at our sort of shared services centers, you know, there are multiple ways, many little ways that we can save money and take money out of the system, and we've got to keep doing that year after year after year. We can simplify FAFSA. We can the federal the student aid for Pell Grants. You know, we have a very complicated FAFSA form now. Sue Donarski at the University of Michigan, educational researcher, has done a very detailed study to show if you ask people 2 questions, families 2 questions, you can get 95% of the information that you need in order to qualify them for a Pell Grant. And the two questions are, what is the size of your family, and what was your income tax statement from 2 years ago? And you cover 95%. So why do we ask people, give them a form that has 23 pages in it that I couldn't fill out probably? And I think I'm fairly experienced in filling out forms. So it's those kind of things that we need to do. The other thing that we believe will be very effective, and it's been effective at many places, is to do matching programs, either with state funds, matching philanthropy, that you raise money for endowed chairs. Berkeley had a fabulous campaign. They got a $100 million gift from a foundation, and they did 20 endowed chairs, and they made them go into certain fields. That is, they didn't let them all go to business or to the sciences, because it's easy to raise money there. They made some of them go to the humanities and some of them go to the English department. But they raised the matching money from private donors in a record 2 years or something to get these fabulous, 100 endowed chairs is what they were getting. Other universities have tried that. Wisconsin has tried it. I think we could have a matching program between the states, philanthropy, private donors at universities, and the federal government to raise money either for scholarships or for endowed chairs. I mean, we need to have a way to get these partnerships going. Another way out of the box idea that we had, and I don't know what you're going to think about this, but I think it's rational. Corporations hire our graduates. What if a corporation stepped up and said, for every graduate that I hire from University of Iowa, I'm going to give a third of the first year's salary back to the university for a scholarship. They do it for search firms. If they use a search firm to hire somebody, they pay a third of the salary to the search. The corporation does to the search firm. I mean, think about the change that would have in our society if a corporation were willing to step up and do that. I mean, those are the kind of ideas that we have. The one I'll give you one more that's one that I've been quite intrigued about. The University of Virginia has done just recently. They've made the decision to take their reserve funds, because you have to reserve as a university for all kinds of catastrophes that may or may not happen, but you have to reserve. So they took all the reserves that were sitting there earning no money and decided to put them in a quasi-endowment and have their foundation manage the fund, and this is lots and lots of money, and they're going to take the proceeds from that source and use it to invest in competitively funded major undertakings for the University of Virginia, and about $300 million of it they're putting into need-based aid. So people are coming up with all kinds of ideas about things that they can do, both to save money and to increase graduation rates, which is the other big piece of the puzzle that we talked about. Is we've got to increase the success rates, because students do not benefit the financial gains that you talked about, Bruce, unless they complete the degree. And so we've got to help them complete the degree. So sorry to go on for so long, and I know others of you have other ideas about things that we can be doing to change that dynamic.
Well, there was a university 90 miles from here that had a rule teaching students in business administration how to incorporate. And Article 1 of any corporate paper was that 10% of the stock went to Maharishi International University.
So if I can add on to Mary Sue's list, I think what's really becoming more and more important is need-based aid. Tuition rates are high for many families, and it really is preventing students from being able to go and attend our universities. And I think that the more we can put into that, the more will be accessible to students who really need the education but can't afford to get it.
And if I think what I'm going to do is probably just put a capstone on what has already been said. But and ironically, I'm not so sure that I'll get booed out of the room. I'm not so sure from our state we need more money as much as predictability. Yes. And then secondly, just cutting the strings that you used, Mary Sue, earlier. There are a whole bunch of restrictions of things that are limiters of things we cannot or should not, and it keeps us from really soaring and building the next 21st century institution. We're stuck with a whole series of little this and little that, and you can't do this, that really are debilitating. And then ultimately, on our own backs, I think we need to build a culture of, I say, at times it feels like the culture is one of dependency with our hand out back to the state, as opposed to saying, no, we're world class, let's go earn our research grants, let's go build new businesses, let's go create new programs and new courses. And we know how to do that, we just need to get on with it.
I think that's true, but I think and I agree with you absolutely. Being able to be more entrepreneurial is really important, but I think the state has an obligation, a firm obligation, to provide some base level of support for its public universities. It just, I mean, it is what makes the state a place that people want to be. And so I worry about, saying, well, you can walk away from that, because those resources are golden because they are unrestricted funds.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that. And I think we should put a lot of energy in that. But at the same time, as someone once said, the one hope is not a strategy. And so at some point, we need to have a plan B. And I'm really frustrated. Maybe it's just 18 months into this. It doesn't seem like anybody's at home thinking about the longer term consequences of some of the things we're talking about at the state. And so the probability is not 100% that we're going to be able to get people, even though the people here in Johnson County and in the room will applaud. It is actually, how do we motivate the electorate to start electing people that care about these things? As some of my friends know, I mean, I'm about this close to saying, okay, if we're going to play this game, where's our PAC? Because all they seem to care about is the people voting. And so I completely agree. Then how do we motivate the states to actually take action? And Jim, now I'm on your turf because you've lived in that world. How do we put pressure on the people to think not in the short term, but about the longer term consequences of some of the things we're talking about here?
And just to add to that question, one person very sadly asks, can logic change voters' minds?
Well, one of the beautiful things about the plan that was proposed originally by Chancellor Bergeneau was everyone had skin in the game. The state had skin in the game, philanthropy had skin in the game, and the federal government had skin in the game. And so it was a matter of matching that if
The leverage.
yeah, right, leveraging. If the state would support a certain amount, it would get a match from the federal government, and a philanthropist would also get a certain amount, so that it was a 3-for-1. And I think that oftentimes can speak. If the state thinks it's going to get money for the money it invests, if the federal government thinks it's going to get money from what it invests, and if a philanthropist thinks that if I give you $100 million, you're actually going to get $300 million, it starts to speak.
Just remember, you're in Iowa. We're talking about tens of millions here.
Okay, sorry.
Point well taken.
I'm going to take the privilege of the moderator to ask another question that hasn't really come up, and as someone from a humanities background, and that is many of the arguments that you all have been making, and for good reason, have to do with economic value. What do we do to convince people of the continued value of history and philosophy and literature and art?
Maybe I can start and say that one of the strongest advocates for the humanities and the arts at the University of Illinois is actually the Dean of the College of Engineering. Because he says that a person who only has the strictly quantitative skills that usually are associated with engineering is a pretty poor engineer. And I would agree with that completely, that so much of what makes our society as rich as it is that balance between the arts, the humanities, the social sciences, and the sciences. So, you know, you probably have heard of STEM, right? Science, technology, engineering, and math. And so many of us are calling it STEAM, adding an A, which stands for the arts, to that. And it's really, really important for our students to get that balance.
Phyllis, that is a very fine concept, but it's not the finest concept, and I'm going to have to educate you.
Okay.
The only concept that makes sense is humanisteem. It could make a fine T-shirt. And one of the oddities in all of this is that, frankly, STEM, which we all totally respect, has had the implication in many universities as kind of sparking an inter-university conflict. And yet it's very interesting. I have never met a scientist that isn't totally for the humanities and art, and I've never met a humanist that isn't totally for the sciences. And so the challenge is, how do you work together? And I struggled with this as a federal official because I ran a very small institution that got very little resources compared with others. And it's hard to measure whether it's 100 to 1, 1,000 to 1, whatever, of research resources going into sciences. And it should go into the sciences. But to leave out the important work that has to be tied, the word history was thrown out. How do we understand ourselves if we don't understand our own history? How do we understand other people if we don't? And then, intriguingly, if you look around the world, there are many societies that think historically. And by this I mean someone will say, well, the reason we should take this tack is, and they'll relate back to an event 250 years earlier, this is the way they thought. In America, the best of Americans are when it comes to problems, we think pragmatically. And we don't relate to history, and we really should do both if we want to understand others and also have a bigger sense of what's happening around us. But these statistics about Americans not understanding our own history is really terrifying. 9% of American high school students don't know which came first, World War I or World War II.
Well, so I've been able to watch this unfold as I have watched the opening and the love generated for the new museum, the National Museum of African American History and Culture. You can not get a ticket because it's so popular. And I've been to the museum and I've seen it, and this is the first museum that really traces the journey of slaves from 1640 all the way up to the present. And this is the most spectacular, wonderful place. It is unbelievable the way it's designed. You go down in a big elevator and you're going down in history to the bottom floors. And it's remarkable, and to see the people in there, it's a transformational experience. In fact, I had one way technology was used. I talked about it at the last with Wally Lowe, who okay. So this is such a great story I have to tell you. So Wally Lowe was the provost here, and went to be president of the University of Maryland. And I had gone to have lunch with him one day, and he said, and the museum had just opened on the mall. And he said, I had the most incredible experience. I now understand the power of Twitter. And what he did was he was going to go to the museum, and he rented a bus, and he said the first 40 students who come and sign up, they're going to go with me on the bus, and we're going to go to the new Museum of African American History and Culture. And they started through the museum, and he started twittering about his emotions and his feelings as he went from the bottom of 1640 up to going through the centuries and the years up to the top of the museum at 7 stories. And he was very moved by this, and he was sending out these tweets. Within an hour, he had 20,000 students from the University of Maryland following him, tweeting back to him about what they were he said it was transformational, that he was expressing his emotions as he saw these exhibits, and it's all about history and culture and art, and it's changed. It's changing the whole way that people look at that time in America. And I thought, you know, that is one of the best examples for me of why we need to pay attention. And look at how long it's taken us to build that museum. But now we have the museum, and it's a great learning tool for our students, and it's a great expression for people who haven't had a place to express for a long time.
At the end of the day, this issue, I think, just, I don't know, it annoys me. At some level, my guess is if we could really do an accounting, and economists would really look at this, we probably would find that as much value has been created across humanity, the time of humanity, through the arts, as has been created crassly in STEM. I don't know if that's right. But at the end of the day, I mean, we sat around as a group a couple of years ago and said, how are we going to make some of the tough decisions we've got to make? And some of it clearly is on student success, and some of it's on the quality of what we do, and some of it's really about some view of the future of what we think we should invest in. But the fourth one, I think you can't escape, which is we all have to have values, and we have to say that it's just who we are. And at the end of the day, I think that's what's wrong with saying that's who we want to be. We'll never be able to justify, my guess, on a spreadsheet, the writing programs and the visual arts programs. But you know, that's us. And it's okay to say, that's us. And by God, we're going to stand up and fight for it every day. And if we can't figure out how to sell it, that's okay. Because we have a lot of students that want to learn and live and explore. And by the way, people from one view, as we've been expressing, who have a STEM background, they're a hell of a lot better having some of the innovation and creativity. And by the way, some of the artists on the other side who need a little discipline are pretty good to rub shoulders up against some of the people with STEM. That interconnection is, I think, a wonderful backbone of our society. And if we start losing it, the mistakes I think we make are when we go one extreme or the other. It's the balance in many ways.
You know, the statistics say that students who are graduating today will have 3 different professions, not just 3 different jobs, not from a bank teller to a bank manager to the bank president, but 3, and your president is actually an example of that, where what you really, really need to learn in a university situation is how to learn. And how to learn, you learn from the arts and the humanities and the sciences as much as from each other, and you never know which one of those or multiples of one you're going to need in your lifelong career.
Could I just
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Could I just comment, because I like to conclude with something very positive.
Please.
In 2 weeks, 2 months, a new museum is going to be opening in Chicago called a Museum to American Writing. Iowa City, Iowa used to be called Pulitzer Town, and there's a poster at the foundation of ours about 40-some Americans tied to Iowa City, Iowa that have won Pulitzers, one of whom, by the way, is a cousin of mine. Anyway, I think that's pretty extraordinary, that this town and its creativity that we so often overlook is the greatest writing center in the world and is our America's international UNESCO designated city of literature. And I'm sure that people in Ann Arbor are kind of envious.
And now that we have summoned that envy, let's go celebrate it at Bell and Blanc at the reception. But first, let's thank our panel for a fascinating discussion.